And this brings me to my conclusions and wrap up for how international responses have developed in order to deal with environmental changes and relations to the topics that we've already covered in this class. The literature and what I've tried to talk about today describes how these responses can fall along an axis of low to high complexity and coordination, from domestic responses that we've looked at last week to bilateral cooperation between two states, to multilateral coordination, to treaties, to international organizations, to norms. The IPC example, the water cooperation efforts, and the data on shared basins, and the discussion about the Arctic show the number of different activities that have occurred in this area and the speed with which some of these issues can be brought to the forefront. There is a reflection in the IPCC reports, as well as everything else that we've read in this semester, that suggests that these changes in the environment has led to changes in the responses over the last 100 years as ways to mitigate the worst of these changes, to adapting to the changes that are going to go forward. And these changes have environmental aspects to it, simple scarcity issues, political institutions, human security issues, and the conflict, the most dramatic aspects, the conflict issues, both domestically and internationally. And I think this kind of brings me to my overall summary for the course, which is crazy, which is bringing it back to where we started, the fundamental questions that really motivated this class and my interest in the material and this research agenda I'm trying to bring into my knowledge and contribute to the literature that we've covered. And the first question is, how does environmental scarcity, or conversely, the abundance of a particular resource like oil, has an effect on human security within countries and across countries, and as well as the underlying risk of conflict that these environmental factors quite bring. Second question, why do states and non-state actors use violence in order to further their aims? We talked in the first section of the class about different motivations, from greed to grievance, physical security of an individual or security of a state, that provide these kind of multiple avenues by which violence can be seen as a legitimate way of pursuing your ends. And then the conflict literature, the civil conflict literature that I'm most familiar with, and I think for just me as an individual, I'm curious to kind of see what it leads individuals like us to choose violence. And a number of different works that we've covered in this semester talks about whether you need to have the means to use violence or the opportunity to use violence, the individual motivations, the opportunity cost or decrease, or the grievances you have against another group, or the state that can provide these explanations for why individuals use violence. And what we've seen is, while overall the levels of violence have decreased over the last century, violence as a way to pursue political or individual ends has not gone away. And while we would like to think, like Fukuyama in the aftermath of the Cold War, that we are at the end of history, these issues and challenges that these motivations that we've covered on this class are going to still create an opportunity for violence, is something that's likely to persist with us in the future. And just as an overall class, what I tried to do in the class as a whole, as well as in each individual class meeting that we've had, is try to start by defining our terms. What are we talking about? What are we not talking about? How does the decisions to define an outcome in different ways lead to different outcomes? To focusing on different parts of the problem, or come to different conclusions. Spent the first part talking about economic development, economic issues and instability, political issues, and then environmental issues in the first part of the class. Then we narrowly focused on the most salient issues covered in the literature for causes of conflict: population, natural resources, food, natural disasters as short-term crises, water, both scarcity, abundance, as well as location. Returned back to population issues through migration, because a lot of these earlier issues can lead people to make the decision to migrate. And then the last section, of course, we didn't have week 13 this semester. Whoops, I should have deleted that. Is I looked at the domestic and international responses to the challenges talked about in the rest part of the class. Over the course of the semester, I tried to bring in a lot of different varied case studies from different regions. Sub-Saharan Africa was one that kept coming up frequently because of the nature of rain-fed agriculture and the increasing susceptibility of people to environmental change given their dependence on it, as well as the frequency of conflicts. But we've talked about South America, Venezuela, Louisiana and Alaska, Central Asia, Southeast Asia, Latin America, Australia. I tried to cover as broad of a base of examples as I could to try to see how varied and interesting and complex the international system is, and how you can usefully narrow it down to a specific aspect to really try to focus on something that's specifically relevant to you. I think you've done a great job in trying to learn how to read the material related to the case studies and the articles that I assigned for this class. And for these articles, I know that they were not the easiest that you probably had in your university career. I tried to focus on the cutting edge and the most influential research in this area, but I tried to reiterate over the course of the semester to focus on the theoretical contribution that each of these articles are really trying to make, as well as the substantive effect of the relationship that they're focusing on, right? That if you have an increase in rainfall, what percentage of an effect does that have on people's living standards, or how food prices might affect conflict, right? Focus on what matters, the substantive effect. The methods are interesting for people who want to get into more in depth, but the idea is to focus on the main theoretical contribution and the empirical effects that each one is trying to make. And I think for all of these essays, you should hopefully notice that through the scientific process, there is in political science, but also in the other fields that we've touched on, a kind of standard way of telling the story and doing the research. You start by motivating and introducing the research question you're really focusing on. You set the stage by talking about the literature, then talk about how your argument kind of fits into that general literature, what you think is going on, that theoretical link between the causal factor and the outcome, how that could be observed in other cases that aren't the ones generating your argument, different research designs using a multitude of different methods that we've touched on in this class. Talk about what you find, see if your findings are dependent on a specific way of doing it, so you see how robust the findings are, and then see what the implications are and how that might link to future research. Hopefully this is a structure that I've encouraged you for your final papers to adopt, and in your empirical section, your research design, try to narrow down the examples and the cases you focused on in a way that you can really get in depth with who's doing what and why in a particular case. The difficulty, of course, with dealing with social science is that there's a lot of different people involved, a lot of different motivations, a lot of moving parts, right? And that can provide a lot of challenges to interpretation. And in this class, we talked about 3 specific challenges that I think are salient in this area, but then also just in your day-to-day life when you're trying to figure out what's going on in the world, or when you're reading things, what other things could be behind the story that somebody's trying to tell. The first is endogeneity, that you can have a relationship you think is because A causes B, but it could be the fact that B also has an effect on A. An example related to the class is that declining resources rents have been found to cause conflict. We talked about that, and we read Ross's discussion of this earlier in the semester. However, if you're a company and you're trying to to extract resources, you might be put off by investing in a particular area, or you might decrease your investment if there's a risk of conflict. So there is this reciprocal relationship that you need to kind of think about in whatever area that you're actually looking at. Also, the idea is that you might have a spurious relationship, some outside factor that's leading to the relationship that you're interested in, that there is some outside factor that's both leading to A and B. So an example that I thought of was that government weakness can cause a reliance both on resource rents. Your economy is not that diversified because your government's not strong enough to be able to encourage diversification, as well as government weakness increased conflict risk, as Fearon and Leighton and others have argued state capacity arguments that we've touched on so far in this class. Next challenge to interpretation is whether you're talking about levels versus change in a particular factor that's leading to an outcome, whether it's conflict or human security or whatever. Is it just the overall factor? Is it the level of resource rents that matter? Or is it changes in the resource rent, spikes in state revenues, like in Venezuela, negative spike in resource rents due to declining oil prices? Or is it just the overall level of dependence on a specific issue, a specific resource? Human security, I talked about earlier today, in that it is a nebulous concept. There's a lot of different ways you can conceptualize security. In this class, we've touched on a lot of them: economic, political, basic sustenance, food, health, environmental, personal security, as well as communal security. There's a lot of different human security threats that we've covered in the class, and how that might link to conflict related to environmental change. Homer Dixon, we started talking about the 3 different primary hypotheses that he had. One was that conflict could be because of simple scarcity of a specific resource, or just all resources. Hypothesis 2 is that because of environmental stress, people will move, and that will cause groups to come into conflict. We've seen examples of that in Eastern Africa. And then hypothesis 3, the deprivation conflicts that just through simple scarcity that could be connected to conflict. Use the analogy of the pie, that environmental change can shrink it, population growth divides it into smaller slices, or distribution connects to grievances at the distribution being ineffective. Lots of indirect relationships that we've touched on in this class, connecting environmental change, human security, and conflict. And in your papers, I've tried to encourage you to kind of focus on one specific piece of that puzzle. Today we've talked a little bit about climate change. It's kind of been in the background of some of the discussions we've had over the course of the semester, that there is literature that suggests that climate change represents a background condition, and that has an indirect effect through linking with other factors that can cause conflict, and that there really hasn't been established evidence that environmental degradation is either a necessary or sufficient condition for conflict. The relation is more interactive, and that as a result, when you think about these links between the environment and conflict, you have to think about these kind of mediating effects. We talked about population. How can it affect resource scarcity and conflict? I'm not going to go into that as much detail. We've covered that already. Domestic responses, talking about mitigation, which we've already touched on, adaptation to environmental change. And then today I spent more time talking about international responses, and that just there's a multiplicity of different levels of responses according to various levels of complexity and interests and overlapping interests that kind of reach a pinnacle with norms in which these kind of incentives can be internalized.